And one of the ideas behind all of that is going back and saying, not what do we think a church should be, not how do we think a church should operate, but what does Jesus say that a church is? And that's what we need to make sure that we are trying to become. That's the target that we need to be aiming at and making sure we're doing everything we can to hit, because we want to be pleasing to Jesus. That's why we're here. He's the reason that we're here, and so we want to make sure we're pleasing Him with everything that we do. So, got a couple of things I wanted to show you with that. Jesus was asked a couple of different questions throughout His ministry, and or He was asked one question, and then He actually gave an instruction. And we think those two things frame the idea behind what a church should do. And so, if you'll notice there in your notes, the first thing that we're going to ask is, what is a church? Okay? So, make sure this thing's working. All right, so, what is a church? A simple church is a spiritual family with Jesus in their midst as their king. So you notice there, we're going to illustrate that with a triangle. So that's going to be kind of a group of a spiritual family, a spiritual gathering. You see the crown there? That's supposed to be a crown. The crown in the center there represents Jesus. So whenever you have people, disciples, believers in Jesus who are gathered together and they've got Jesus in the midst of them and they're focused on obeying Him and loving Him, then you have a church, okay? That's a simple definition of what a church is. So what should a church then do? Like, what is it that we're supposed to do? I mean, do you just get together and hey, we like, ultimate fighting, so let's just gather together and just watch the fight. We like the Huskers, let's gather together, watch the game. Do we just do that? Or what do we do as a church? For those of you that are on the edge of your seat right now, it's not gather together and watch the Husker game, all right? I just want to go ahead and deflate that bubble right away. And so let's talk about what is it that we do. So what does a simple church do? And we see that, first of all, it's there in your notes. Jesus was asked a question. And it says there in Matthew chapter 22 that a lawyer came. He was one of these religious leaders that were there in Israel. And so it wasn't, like a guy that, sues people and stuff like that. But it had been an expert in the Old Testament law, God's law. So it says, one of them, a lawyer, asked him a question to test him. They were trying to, trick Jesus into saying something wrong. So he asked him a question to teach him, and to trick him, test him. And it says, "Teacher, which is the great commandment in the law?" And he said to him, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the great and first commandment. And a second is like it, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments depend all of the law and the prophets." Okay, so what you see is Jesus is saying here that there are two big commands that kind of sum up all of the Old Testament, right? So if you read the Old Testament and you're like, man, there's so much stuff here, I don't know what all to do. Jesus kind of sums it all up. Cliff Note version is love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. Everything else in the law is fulfilled if you're fulfilling those two things. Everything else hangs on those two things. So what we're going to see here then is that a simple church is going to obey the great commandments. And so we see, first of all, that they will love God. Okay, so this spiritual family that's gathered together, they're going to be focused on loving God. That's the first commandment. Right? So they're focused on loving God. The second thing would be that they're going to be focused on loving others. Okay? We're going to obey, if we're a simple church and we're gathered together with Jesus in our midst, we're going to please Him. We're going to be focused on loving God, and we're going to be focused on loving others. So then what's the third thing that we're going to do? I've alluded to it already when I talked about what kind of drove us to make some of these changes and some of the shift in 2014, and that is the Great Commission. Okay? And so after Jesus was crucified and died and rose again, He spent 40 days here on the earth, continuing to train His disciples and get ready to leave them behind to carry on His mission. And right before He left, He gave them what's called the Great Commission. And in the Great Commission, He says this, Jesus came and said to them, "All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me." Okay, so all the authority of God is coming together and is saying this is something that you should do. It's not the great suggestion. Okay, it's not the great advice. This is the great commission. It's a command that Jesus is giving to us based on all the authority that God has. And he says this, "Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all that I have commanded you. And behold, I am with you always to the end of the age." So this whole commission, all these things that are said, they all are driving behind the main idea of making disciples. So we're called, if we're going to follow Jesus, and we're going to be a simple church, then we are also going to focus on making disciples. Now you see there's a lot of other things that go into making disciples. There's a lot of other things that go into loving God, loving others, all of those kind of things. There's a lot of stuff that we'll do, but they can all kind of be summarized under these three things. That we're going to be focused on three simple things: loving God, loving others, and making disciples. That can be the thing that we're called to do as a church, those three things, and that can serve as a way to evaluate everything that we do. Now, for those of you that are tracking along with me, you can see we would complete following Jesus if we did these three things. So we're going to kind of sum that up and call it obey GCsquared. All right. So if we're obeying the Great Commandment and we're obeying the Great Commission, then we're going to be pleasing Jesus. Right. Now, if you think about church, if you were to go to somebody on the street and you said, "What do you think a church is?" you probably would not get this for an answer. You would probably not get, "Oh yeah, a church, it's all about," you might get loving God, you might get loving others, you might get making disciples, but most of the time, if you go to somebody, you're going to get an answer more like I got when I came to start Redeemer. Came up here and people said, "Well, why did you move to Omaha from Nebraska?" It just like, Omaha from Florida. And I would say, "Yeah, we lived in Florida, we moved up here," and so people are like, "Why'd you do that? That's stupid." It's like, okay, thanks for that. Have you ever lived in Florida, like in the summer? Then don't talk bad about me like I'm crazy. You should try that out first. But it naturally follow. Well, why would you move from the beach to Omaha? Like, why would you do that? And we'd say, "Well, we came to start a church." And then they're like, "Okay, well, where is it?" And I'm like, "Well, it's not yet. We're gathering people together. That's what the church is." And they're like, eyes glaze over, and they're like, "Well, let me know when you get a building." Right? Because what do most people think about when they think about a church? They think about, here's a building, it's got a steeple on top, and that's where we go, and that's if we want to worship God, we go there, and we worship God. So people have different ideas about what a church would be. For example, think about it this way. Draw a rectangle around that triangle there, and you see on the outside there's programs. What's a program? That's not the thing that we hand out on Sunday morning, but rather it's like a class, or it's something that we do, and it's maybe to meet somebody's need. Okay? For example, you may have a youth ministry. Okay? And so you would have a specific gathering together for teenagers. And so you would have a youth ministry. Is that a bad thing? I don't know. I mean, it depends on if you like teenagers, I guess. I was a youth pastor once, and at the time I said, like, I'm beginning to think these are bad things. But no, I'm just kidding. But no, that's not a bad thing. So you can have programs that are not necessarily bad things. But did Jesus say start programs? No, he didn't say start programs. He said make disciples, right? Or so we might go to the next thing, if I can get this thing to work right. And so we might have buildings. Well, I already mentioned that already. People would say, hey, we got, a building. Maybe we don't have a individual building with a steeple on top, but maybe we do like we have here. We have a storefront, and this is our place 24/7, and so now we've got a building. I know when we moved in here, a lot of people kind of felt like, oh, now you're a legitimate church, and so, is a building bad? No, a building's not bad, but did Jesus say go and build buildings? No, he said make disciples, right? Love God, love others, make disciples. Here's another thing. You may have budgets, right? Because when you get a building and you're running programs, then you have to have a budget, right? Because you've got to be bringing in money to pay the rent. The next thing you might have is you might have staff. If you got to have a budget because you got to pay for the staff, you really got to pay for the staff. Jesus did say, pay the staff. No, I'm just kidding. Right? So, yeah. No, but are any of these things bad? No, they're not bad. But were they commanded by Jesus? No. So they are things that may be there and may be good and may be helpful, but are not necessary in order to be a church. Okay? So we go on and we look and we see, well, I tell you what, let's go back. So we look at this, and if this is kind of our paradigm, this is what a church has to be. Like if we say this rectangle is not just good stuff that's not necessarily required, but if we say we've got to have these things to have a church, then how difficult is it to actually start a church? Well, since I have some experience in the area, what I would tell you is it's very difficult. It's extremely difficult to start a church with all of this in mind, right? You come in and you got to, first of all, you got to sell people on the fact that we are a church, but we don't have a building yet. And you got to sell people on, what all's actually taking place. And no, we don't drink Kool-Aid. It's actually grape juice, and that kind of thing. We're not a cult, but we are a church. You've got to sell them on all this kind of stuff. You've got to begin to raise that money. You've got to begin to bring in the right people and the right staff, which then makes it even harder to keep, perpetuating what's going on. You can't really preach hard because you got to make sure everybody's happy because they'll keep coming back and keep giving money. And, it gets very difficult. And so I talk to people when they're talking about coming in and starting churches. In fact, I don't say, are Rick and Angie here? I don't think I see them anywhere. But yeah, Rick and Angie Posey moved here from Arkansas a little while ago. They're living out near Lake Cunningham, and they're doing exactly this. They're coming up and they're saying, we want to start a church. And so we're talking about what does that look like and how do you do that? And in fact, he and I were on the phone just this last week, and we're saying, to get from where you're at to get to where we are, it's very difficult. It's very hard to do. And if we're going to change the city of Omaha, then what's going to happen is we've got to have a lot of churches that are taking Jesus to a lot of diverse and different kind of areas. Okay? So I was just kind of fiddling around with some figures and stuff this week. And really, I started off thinking about it this way, and I said, we've had the tagline, this month of, we want to take Jesus from our zip code to the ends of the earth until there's no place left. So I said, what if we were to say we need a church in every zip code in Omaha? That would be about 40, I forget the exact number, but it's around 40, I think, zip codes. So let's say we said, okay, we need a church in every zip code in Omaha. And this is the model that we've got that we're saying we're going to start 40 of these bad boys. It's taken us like 7 years to get to where we are right now. And I've got to say, it demonstrated the favor of God that we ever made it here to this point. I've got other people that are friends of mine that are just as qualified as I am, that are better leaders than I am, that have better ideas than I have, all these kind of things, and they're struggling to make it. They've come to start churches here in Omaha. They're struggling to make it. It's hard to do. How are we going to start 40 churches like that so we have a church in every zip code? Well, we're not. And in fact, I don't even think that's enough. I don't think that having a church in every zip code is enough. I think a better way, and I'm still not even sure this is exactly as many as we need, but I started thinking about it this way. I think we actually need a church in every quadrant, every square mile block in Omaha. You know how it's laid out in that grid? That would be approximately, if we went from, the river out to the Elkhorn River, we'd have about 340 of those if we went from Bennington down to Cape Hart Road. There'd be about 340 of those square mile blocks. How in the world are we ever going to get 340 of these started in order to reach Omaha and make a difference? Well, it's going to be very difficult. But if we remove kind of our preconceived notions, I'm going the wrong way. And we go back to what Jesus said, and we're saying we need to start simple churches. A simple church is a gathering of a spiritual family where Jesus Christ is in their midst as their Lord. And what they're doing is they're focusing on loving God, they're focusing on loving others, and they're focusing on making disciples.